And we're really lucky to have Jacqueline Pirot, who is Vice President of Policy for Nuvi Corporation, which offers bidirectional EV supply equipment, hardware, and software that aims to dynamically harness the power of batteries. And Jackie is experienced in policy analysis and advocacy for new technologies in a bunch of places, really diverse, UK, Denmark, United States, and European Union. She's also a great speaker. Before I hand it over to Jackie, I want to say that for the rest of the meeting, following this next session, we'll have a brief report on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's 6th assessment, and followed by a short presentation by Carleen Cullen on her work with others, looking at the state of EV fast charging reliability in the Bay Area with some very current data. And then we'll have reports from the organizations. And last, some housekeeping. Please put yourself on mute when you're not talking and keep it there until you speak. And we'll start with questions in chat. We'll very likely be able to also have live back and forth. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jackie.
Thank you for that very nice introduction. I feel very confident now. You definitely pumped me up. I'm just going to share my screen and go to presentation mode and go to the beginning of the actual presentation. Okay, so going past the disclaimer, because we're now a public company actually, I'm going to talk about who my company is just a little bit and what we do to give a little bit of context for the things that I'm going to talk about. As Robert said, my company works around the world. We work with integrating electric vehicles to the grid. We're a software platform that actually works with control, coordination, and aggregation of electric vehicles to try to make them into both usable resources for the electric grid for stakeholders that are like electric utilities, CCAs, or even transmission system operators. But also individual EVs, we figure out how best to integrate them with the grid. What does that actually mean? What does vehicle grid integration mean? It's a fairly wishy-washy term. Really, it means any use of the EV's flexibility of both the time and rate at which it can charge to coordinate it with all of the other pieces of the changing grid. So figuring out how best to actually fit EVs in as a piece that works along with distributed solar, rooftop solar, batteries, heat pumps, the loads in houses, other EVs that are charging at different times, and the output of generation, and even how can they charge differently to alleviate grid stress that the different actors are perceiving. Nuvi's been working on that for quite some time, both with normal vehicles and with bidirectional electric vehicles, meaning vehicles that are capable of discharging their battery if asked, just like a stationary battery would, just like Powerwall would. This is something that does need to be requested. The EV isn't just going to discharge. And so what Nuvi does is actually work with utilities and other grid actors to understand, are there price signals that we can get? Can we get direct requests from the utility to actually change how EVs are charging or request to actually discharge? Or is there some sort of a schedule that we should be working on? So you can see in this diagram that what I'm what we see EVs as is not something that should be tacked on to the end of the grid. We're trying to learn from the solar experience. At first, before smart inverter standards, before time of use, you had thousands of solar panels being put on rooftops that had only a few settings, a few requirements. Don't electrocute anyone. And if the grid drops to actually not continue to generate energy and potentially actually make an unsafe environment. EVs are starting to be in that same place where they're starting to say, we need to not just have them out at the edge of the grid the way solar originally was. We need to think before we have millions of EVs, how do we actually fit them into the grid now? And that's the essence of vehicle grid integration. It's not about letting enough EVs get on the grid that they become a problem the way solar did, that they actually may unbalance the grid and cause power outages. Instead, we need to plan. We need to say, how do we actually want to place EV chargers, both physically so that people can use them, and where on the grid? And how do we actually want them to be charging so that they can be not only not a problem for the grid, but potentially a resource for the grid. I've been asked to talk a bit about the federal funding that is coming down to both fund and to direct how these funds will be used for both transportation electrification and vehicle grid integration. My perspective is definitely very focused on that bi-directional idea of EVs becoming these little small generators that can be aggregated to have a real impact on the grid. We work with electric vehicles, but we also work with this idea of them as storage. And so the policy that I work in is both transportation electrification and distributed energy resource policy, because we see EVs as both. We think that they're just another type of battery or solar panel. And therefore, one of the biggest things that we've seen that the federal government has done in the last 6 months is establishing a new joint office between the Department of Energy and the Department of Transport. And this is a huge signal that the federal government is saying, we understand that this is not just about getting EVs on the road, it's about getting EVs on the grid and getting them on the grid in a way that makes sense. The existence of that office is going to have a real impact on the way that things happen across the country. What I've noticed among the different programs that have gotten funded, for example, the NEVI, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. This is tens of billions of dollars of funding that is being given to every state to work with the large charging corridors so that people can be driving hundreds of miles across state lines and have access to high-powered chargers in locations that make sense. Each state is actually working with the Department of Transport at the state level to propose a plan for how they will actually implement and use the funding that they'll be allocated by the federal government. Those plans are due in August. States like California have been thinking about this and working on it for a long time. We're probably going to get them in much earlier, like May. So while those plans will probably have been approved, there will be a lot of work to actually implement them. And that's something that can be watched by groups like yours to actually see how is the state planning on really working with these huge tranches of funding. One of the things that was exciting for me was that they actually include a stipulation that a bidirectional electric vehicle charger can be funded with this program just the way a normal electric vehicle charger can. We've, even at the state level in California, had to do a lot of work to actually get that realization. And the federal government saying that hopefully will be kind of a placeholder for all other states to look at for guidance. The Smart Grid Investment Matching Program, I was really interested to see, actually has new language. So this program was established in, I think, 2007. The Energy Act of 2007, I think it is. And this year, they actually included new smart grid provisions. And one of those things is that electric vehicles actually qualify, electric vehicle chargers qualify as something that can be funded for smart grid projects. These are things that go to utilities. And this is 50% match funding for projects that actually work on increasing grid resiliency, on increasing the smartness of the grid, cybersecurity, and electric vehicle charging stations are going to be at the center of all of those things as they become more common. So this is something that, I know that PG&E could be working with. I don't know if Marin Clean Energy would actually qualify for it, but I think there's someone on the call that could probably tell us. But seeing electric vehicles included there as a source of both flexibility and resiliency, I think, is a big signal of the way that they're actually looking at EVs now. The EPA's Clean School Bus Program, which is $2.5 billion just for electric school buses and another 2.5 for clean school buses, which could be hydrogen, propane, natural gas, any other types of things. Also actually highlights the V2G capability that several bus manufacturers are including in their buses now, in their electric buses. And that originated actually with the California Energy Commission in their Clean School Bus Program, giving the bus manufacturers a technical specification. They wanted this funding, they needed to actually include this capability in their production models. And so you now have Bluebird, for example, one of the biggest school bus manufacturer in the country, now putting out thousands of electric buses that all are able to discharge their battery. They just need to be paired with the right kind of charging station. That kind of thing is going to be transformative, I think. And the EPA knows this. They've actually stood up a web page educating schools that this capability is probably going to be actually sitting inside the electric bus that they're going to get. The Surface Transportation Block Grant also, it focuses on the idea of vehicle grid integration, that not every installation is going to be exactly the same, that there needs to be thought put into how these major, multi-megawatt installations will actually go in, how to make them fit with the grid. And that will look different in California than it does in Iowa. There's also, I wanted to point out on the equity side, the Justice 40 initiative. So this is actually a whole of government effort, which, if I remember correctly, is 40% of the funds for climate action, for electrification of buildings, for electrification of EVs, has to go to disadvantaged communities. This is the federal funding. It's a huge mandate to have. And you see that in California too. As somebody who reads these regulatory documents, there's a priority that is being set out, that a lot of the funding for various elements of transportation electrification, building electrification, has to go to disadvantaged communities. I saw a question in the chat. It says, is there any opportunity for public comment into California's plan for NEVI funding? I know that the states were setting up stakeholder advisory groups to actually give public input, well, public to the extent that you have to have gotten on the advisory group. But I believe it'll be going through California's Department of Transportation. And if this group wanted to reach out, you could see if there's actually still a chance to give some kind of public input. I also wanted to give a little bit of sort of my perspective on the goings on in California. We all know about the ZEV mandate, zero emissions vehicles, hoping for 80% by 2035, if I remember correctly. We also have a rooftop solar mandate. We have the CEC actually making a major battery push, and by that I mean in a home electrification program that they're establishing for market rate housing. Actually, they are pushing for batteries to actually be part of essentially the design specification for an all electric home. And that kind of forethought, I think, is the type of thing that starts to get you into this place of real resiliency, of real grid hardening. And it goes along with new building codes that, again, I think the 2023 building code from the CEC is actually starting to look at how to get EV capacity included in new builds. I would love it if there was some kind of a preemptive interconnection for vehicle to grid, just the way we're seeing that starting for solar. And I think once we see that sort of change happening, where it's not just you can get solar interconnected before you move in, you can also get your battery. You can also have a charging station that's interconnected as a small generator before you ever move in. Those are the kinds of things that I think are really going to move us forward. But you can see it starting to happen. California's Advanced Clean Trucks rule is now going into effect and is actually being adopted across the country. I think there's like a dozen other states, at least at this point, that have adopted it. And that's a medium and heavy duty version of the ZEV mandate, essentially. The medium and heavy duty space has largely been sort of put off till later, until the last few years. And suddenly it's become much more, a much more in focus element of the transportation electrification push. And if ever there was something that it would be interesting for, civic groups to start thinking about, it would be how medium and heavy duty vehicles driving through their communities are actually powered. It is possible to have emissions-free zones. London has done it. And so figuring out when and how that kind of thing can happen, it's something that definitely geographically bounded areas can work with. We also have the governor's emergency declaration from a year or two ago, which was fairly terrifying, but it really laid out all of the things that have been going on with wildfires, all of the things that have been going on with heat storms, and essentially said, we are empowering and commanding all of the agencies to take this as a marching order to do anything they can to actually address these problems. And you're starting to see that actually grinding more things into motion with the agencies. I did want to point out that we actually have a VGI law in California. It's SB 676. And this essentially mandates that any electrification that happens has to actually look for ways to integrate those vehicles to the grid in an effective way. And it's a broad law, but it actually resulted in some real regulatory proceedings at the CPUC. And I think it's also something that can be used actually if you see that there are things being done with transportation electrification that aren't including any kind of a VGI element. There's a law that's actually saying that you're supposed to be doing that. I'll definitely get to that in a minute. Also, we have the CEC's AB 2127 EV infrastructure assessment. It's a mouthful, but this is actually a 2-year process that the CEC is now going through every 2 years to do a huge modeling exercise to actually look how many EVs in every class do we need, ports, school buses, light duty, transit. How many are we going to have? What's our estimate? When are they going to charge? How are they going to charge? Is that actually going to work with the grid the way it is now? What are we going to need to actually get these things charging on the grid and charging with clean energy? It's on the CEC's website, and I believe it actually is just labeled the AB 2127 EV Infrastructure Needs Report. But if you're a bit of a wonk, it is a fascinating read, and it really is a guidebook that has it's influenced the way that new programs have been authorized over the last couple of years. These assessments are actually very important. They have had opportunities for public comment in the past. and we're coming into the new cycle. And so that is something that you can get involved in. You can read. The CEC is very accessible when it comes to actually putting in comments, and I recommend that you do, because this is an influential report. We've got the advanced clean cars rule. So it's the carbing, and they are working on battery durability standards. Essentially, how do you have the second and third person who owns an EV be able to have a viable EV with the original battery? And it's quite a stretch, but those are the kinds of things they're trying to do to make EVs more accessible to people who might not be able to afford a new EV up front at the current prices. And the CPUC has been in a burst of activity. After the heat storms, they developed the emergency load reduction program over the course of about a year and a half. And this is actually meant to be an all hands on deck effort to prevent anything like the rolling blackouts that happened 2 years from happening again. And they actually include electric vehicles. They include V2G as a resource that can be compensated under this emergency program. And they'll compensate you for export, just like a solar panel, which is something that had never happened in California before. But it was really a watershed moment, both in California and really across the country. That said, and I'm sort of getting into the question of what's the cutting edge here. There's something called UNIDE, which it is an acronym. I cannot remember what it means, but it is actually for transactive energy rates. What does that mean? This is the CPUC saying that we don't have any way for an electric vehicle or a bidirectional electric vehicle to combine with solar and a battery and have the capability of all those pieces be compensated for their real value to the grid. And these types of rates, one of which SoCal Edison is developing, are actually meant to say, what does the utility need? How congested is the grid? What generation? Is there a coal plant? Is there a solar plant operating? How's the transmission system doing? Put those all together and actually give a live price signal to anyone that is on this rate. So you can actually be deciding, where a company like mine can help an EV owner decide, do I want to buy my energy now? Do I want to sell it now? Should I not charge it all now? And also, we actually have new EV infrastructure rules, meaning utilities are actually in California are going to be able to just do all of the installation work for new electric vehicle charging stations under their normal business operations. They're not going to need to be funded by a specific bill from the government. This is just going to be part of the way that they work. And that is a major step in normalizing how EVs are actually going to be rolled out across the state. At the local level, and Marin County, Marine Clean Energy is actually leading on a lot of this, is actually REACH codes. A REACH code is actually the building code. And essentially, building codes are they're pivotal for how electric vehicles will actually get both installed, or electric vehicle charging stations will get installed, and how they will be used, how many of them we can fit on the existing network without having to do major upgrades, and how they'll actually interact with whole house electrification. As I said, actually, Marine Clean Energy, I think, has done some really cool stuff, or Marin County has done some very cool stuff with this, but those are things that they've clearly been open to working with before. And so as stakeholders, that's actually a lever that you can pull to actually try and work with them on this. Further, I just wanted to talk about for vehicle to grid, because this is my bread and butter. Are there actually value streams? Can you actually get paid to do this? Is this really a good idea? Across the country, actually, utilities and states are saying yes. So New York has what's called their value of distributed energy resources export rate. And they include vehicle to grid EVs as something that can be compensated under this rate, just like solar panel, just like a battery. They're looking more at what are resources anywhere on my grid and how much is them putting energy out worth at any given time. And that kind of lens is, I think, probably the most important way to look at these things. We've got demand response programs in Massachusetts and across New England that, again, they're existing programs, but they are looking for ways to bring EVs into them, looking for ways that vehicle to grid could be shoehorned into existing programs just to try it. And that sort of willingness to just have a look is really what we're looking for. We'll get perfect programs for us later, but figuring out if you have a demand response program in your area, if an electric vehicle can participate when they never have before, is actually a fairly easy way to figure out how to help integrate an electric vehicle to the grid. A lot of utilities are already including electric vehicles in these programs, but it's always worth asking. I talked about the emergency load reduction program, SoCal Edison's rate. SDG&E is also doing a standard rate application that will actually get you live prices, and they'll add in extra if they have a critical peak day. They will pay you for your vehicle's ability to feed energy back to the grid 18 days a year. There are also different ways to fund things. In New Hampshire, we have a bill where they're actually saying, we, the government, will help fund buying an electric bus if you actually sign a contract with us that you'll be in our demand response programs later. And that kind of relationship along the life of the vehicle is actually a very interesting model. I don't think you can do it in California because of the regulatory structure, but we're looking at everything here. And I already mentioned that MCE has actually done some of the cooler things in California. So if you haven't seen their presentation on some of the pilots that they've done, it's definitely worth asking them to come. So I think that may be what, and some of the other sort of just general ideas that can be pushed for in the utilities make-ready programs. And what make-ready means is when you go to actually put an electric vehicle charging station in a parking lot, you got to hook it up. You got to have new electric lines run, maybe communications line run. There's trenching. You got to actually make sure that the grid has enough energy or capacity to bring you the energy that you're asking for. Right now, utilities, understandably, in many ways, are interested in just having a totally new connection for your EVs, but that's actually a quite expensive way to do it. It may be simpler, but it also sort of isolates the EV out by itself. You can't then, if you're putting it on a totally new connection to the grid, you can't combine it with solar. You can't combine it with batteries. You can't do demand response. The transactive energy rates, the things like SoCal Edison is doing, where they're just saying, what's the objective value of this vehicle on the grid, may actually help us integrate EVs that are put in a situation like that. But it's something that should be looked at every time you install an EVSC. Whether it's a really complicated rate or not, having rates that actually incentivize you to be charging when the sun is up is actually something that I think would be a pretty easy way to coordinate the electric vehicle ambitions with the solar mandate. Right now, they're not really that well coordinated. And I don't know why not. You know, we want EVs to be charging during the day. So that may mean having more workplace charging programs, way more funding for workplace EVSE installation, maybe different rates that actually make it either very cheap or free, or you get paid to actually charge during the day when that duck curve is actually pumping out all that energy. I don't think we've seen that yet. But it's something that I hope happens in the future rather than turning away from workplace charging funding. I think we should be accelerating it, and we should be figuring out how to actually put those EVs where they can fill the belly of that duck. We just talked about building codes earlier and about associating EV funding with participation in demand response programs over the life of the vehicle. So I think that's actually all I have. That is. But I see we have a fair amount of questions in the chat. So Bob, I'll sort of let you say how you'd like to do it now.
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for a real clinic on vehicle-to-grid integration. That was terrific. I guess I'd like to start with a question about what are the obstacles to vehicle grid integration really scaling? For example, to what extent are lack of uniform standards an obstacle? The IOUs. I wonder if you could speak about that.
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. I think standardization of new technologies is something that, as someone in the private industry, we hope that industry can be allowed to hash it out as much as possible, because we generally think that we'll land on the thing that makes the most sense to actually implement the things we're trying to do. That said, governments and individuals generally see that process as at least a delaying force, if not a barrier, and there's temptation to mandate a standard. We're seeing some of that with communication standards. And communication standards, when I'm talking about electric vehicles, it is about actually getting messages to and from the vehicle about the rate at which you want them to charge, and what are they allowed to do at this location, and how to make sure they don't actually overcharge or something and melt the copper there. We're still working through that process, and I think that it's starting to come together, I think, but that's probably something that's delayed it a bit, because the utilities have different ideas about what the messages should be than the automakers. And I definitely have a third set of ideas. That's one. When it comes to just hardware and technical standards, those kinds of things are actually pretty well worked out, I would say. We had a few years for bidirectional vehicles in particular, a process that lasted a couple of years with the Public Utilities Commission, where we really worked through it with the IOUs to understand if the same standards that are used for stationary batteries could be used for a battery that's in an electric vehicle. And the answer was pretty much yes. And that confirmation has actually served as a springboard for starting this industry, both here and across the country, because California really does serve as a bellwether. So we're getting through it.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is take the chat questions or comments from the top, and then the people who submitted them would have an opportunity to clarify what they're attempting to say if they want to. Kurt Johnson from the Climate Center says that Governor Newsom has proposed a $10 billion zero emission vehicle budget. There'll be a press conference next Wednesday highlighting the magnitude and importance of vehicle to grid. So that will be helpful.
That's fantastic. Great, looking forward to it.
Jim Burrows asked a question about bidirectional charging that in part we've covered here. Can bidirectional charging stations be installed now in anticipation that all future EVs, including buses, will be equipped with bidirectional charging? Or are there standardization issues that make it risky to do that?
So yes, you can install a bidirectional charging station in advance. If you have the inverter, which is the actual thing that allows you to discharge the car back and forth to the grid, just like a solar panel. If you have that in the EVSE, you either have to go through the small generation interconnection process with your utility, just like you would with a solar panel, or you can actually have it set by the manufacturer to only charge to unidirectional mode. And it will essentially be a normal charger for up to 5 years, as set by the CPUC, during which time you can actually have it changed to bidirectional mode once you've gone through the process with the utility and once you actually have a car that you want to use it with. So when it comes to the idea of standardization issues, I think the only thing that I can think of that would be potentially a branch in the road that you could miss is if you ended up 5 years down the road with an EV that actually has the inverter on board. I think you can, so you would need essentially a different kind of charging station. So probably you would, want to just have the charging station that fits your EV that you're planning on buying. So that's, but I don't know.
So John Sarter from TC Bell, you've had your hand up for a while. You want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks. I'm sorry I couldn't type in chat. I'm on my phone. So I wanted to ask, I heard a rumor that Nuvi is focusing more on software and aggregation than actual physical hardware for bidirectional charging. Is that correct?
It's not a rumor, I'm screaming it, yeah.
Okay. All right, great.
So we're a software platform. We work with charging station manufacturers to actually get our specifications and our software and firmware integrated with the EVSEs that we want to work with. So we white label charging stations that are built to our specs, and we'll actually sell those with the manufacturer. But we don't manufacture them, and we don't want to.
Okay, great. Well, that's good because that's what we do and that's what we want to do. So I think we're probably already having some talks with you. I invited Dan Fletcher, our co-founder, to be on, but he wasn't able today. But so I think most of you probably know that Decibel is producing a bidirectional EV charger combined with a solar inverter. And at some point, I'd love to give a further presentation on that to the group.
Yeah, I run into Dan on the Vehicle Grid Integration Coalition calls. And Decibel is actually, they're doing a very cool thing, where it's actually a whole optimization of the house and the car and the EV and the solar. And so, there are a lot of different use cases and manifestations of the idea of a bidirectional vehicle and of the idea of vehicle grid integration. And so I never want people to think that it's one thing. It's any way that you can be integrating that vehicle, whether it's optimizing your house or serving the grid.
Right, exactly. Excellent, thank you.
So Susanna Saunders from Sierra Club asks, why is it that California utilities cannot pay customers for EV or storage or electric buses battery storage?
It has to do with their regulatory structure. In some states, a utility is allowed to own generation resources, particularly own generation resources behind a retail meter. In California, in general, except for I think very specific exceptions, the utilities are not allowed to do that just by their funding structure, their regulatory mandate, and their structure as a company. I know they've tried to figure out ways that they could do this, different bank shots that they could do that kind of investment, but they're just not allowed to. And, part of it actually goes back to 2001 and the way that they ended up saying that utilities needed to operate.
Okay. So Pam Reeves is a MCL board member and active in other organizations as well, asked, does MCE or others encourage EVs to charge? This is a question really for MCE. maybe Leanne, you can answer this. Maybe does MC or others encourage EVs to charge during the day with solar available? Do they want to move EV charging to nighttime with managed response time? Why not do what Sonoma Clean Power does? Leanne, do you want to handle this or deal with this offline?
Oh, well, I did add a brief response in the chat. I'll have to remind myself what Sonoma Clean Power does. I know quite a few of the CCAs have got some programs around this, but we've also launched some pilot programs and certainly encourage daytime charging when obviously that's going to be supported with our renewable energy. And then we've got a pilot app, kind of a phone app that we've been running. And it's seeing when the majority of charging is happening, which I think we are seeing is happening during the day, hopefully at workplace charging stations, but then encouraging charging at night. So not until after that 9 o'clock time period and after that peak ramp.
Yeah.
You know, what we would love is someday to be able to have, you know, the charging that an EV or a bus does during the day with that. So when the solar energy is pumping, can actually be compensated at night, even if you're in a different place. And these are the types of implementations you can see with transactive energy rates that are just starting to be investigated. But MCE is doing really cool stuff with this. You know, I definitely think that they're a leader in California.
We are so excited about bidirectional buses. Last year, perhaps the year before, the CEC had a grant that would support the purchase of bidirectional buses within school districts. And we asked every school district, please, we'll help you with this grant, will you participate? We didn't find any takers, but I think we're in a different position now, and I hope to be supporting some of those in the near future.
And that's what we need. You know, grants are really scary. I hate grants, and you know, I'm supposed to be a professional. And so, you know, schools that are working through this kind of thing by themselves, you know, if they don't have the money to hire a grant writer or a consultant, having companies like MCE there to actually offer to help is what they're going to need. You're seeing both California and the federal government actually standing up technical assistance programs to help schools actually navigate the process and understand what they're going to need and how to successfully get an electric bus. But there is just an avalanche of funding coming both from the state of California and the federal government for school buses in particular. So I hope you do get some takers.
So Susanna Saunders from Sierra Club to ask, is the technology for V2G and vehicle to home ready for prime time? My town has said that they want to wait on electric trucks to make sure the technology will work.
So the vehicle to grid, it's been interesting. You know, there's this idea that V2H doing just to the home optimization is sort of a step on the way to full vehicle to grid. But actually, the first things we've gotten installed in California and the first revenue we're going to make in California is going to be vehicle to grid. We have multiple electric school bus installations in SDG&E territory with Bluebird buses and I think Lion buses that we're planning on participating in the emergency load production program this summer. So we'll actually discharge during the events, if, you know, in times of heat stress for the grid, and we'll be paid for it. So from my perspective, I feel like vehicle to grid is running ahead, but having companies like Ford and GM actually starting to include the ideas of V2H, of either home optimization or emergency backup in their advertising even, I think it shows that that's definitely coming pretty quickly. When it comes to trucks, I know that I think BYD and maybe Lion are talking about putting out trucks with this capability. But you know, I think those are the kinds of things you'll see it. You'll start to see it when they're ready. The companies will make noise about it.
Okay, and David, who has his hand up, I'll just go through the question and then turn it over to you. Says that GM has announced, and PG&E have announced a vehicle to building pilot to provide California homeowners and businesses resiliency if and when the grid goes down. David?
Thank you, Bob. No, I'd just like to reinforce what Jacqueline has been saying. And really, it is about how do you bring those millions of cars into the situation where it does supply the total grid. I know that John Sarter and I have been working on the decibel, and it's a V2B. It's really going to be only associated with buildings. Jacqueline's company deals with the larger transport systems that can have that about capacity to go to grid. And but when you start thinking about resiliency in California and wildfires, I know that Mary Barra and Patty Poppy from PG&E are really concerned that they want to make sure they get vehicle to buildings so they can build resiliency in. So we have massive interest, General Motors, PG&E, all driving the same solution set that we need to bring batteries, car batteries, to play amongst the whole possibility. And it's an exciting field. I know that Sunrun with their partnership with Ford is doing that now. It's an 82 amp battery to house charger. So that this is probably the most exciting thing that's happened in solar almost ever. And so it's an exciting thing. And I thank Jacqueline for her articulation of the vehicle to grid. And on the other side, there's vehicle to buildings behind the meter that's going to be just as vibrant. So thank you.
Hey, quick little disclaimer there, David. This is John Sarter again from Decibel. Decibel is being certified as a grid interoperable inverter, so it will have that functionality. It's just going to take the right aggregator, such as Nuvi, to bring it into play and capitalize on those assets.
Okay, John.
Great.
And I think, what this conversation really shows is that, again, there's no one thing that defines this. The significance of a Ford F-150 Lightning to a house or to the grid is just going to be different than that of a school bus or a Nissan Leaf. And so actually saying, how does this vehicle and all its others like it actually fit into this project of cleaning the grid, hardening the grid, making it more resilient? That's how we really integrate them, rather than pretending there's some sort of one fits all implementation. And so having companies like Decibel, like Sunrun out there is really exciting. I'm glad that I'm not alone making these cases. But I will say it depends on why the grid is going down. If there is a public power shutoff, if there is a violent storm, that grid is going down and you're going to want emergency backup. If it is a heat emergency, a time of great grid stress, is possible that all of the EVs on the grid are actually better used to help keep the grid from going down in the first place. That's a great first effort from the vehicles that are going to be able to respond. But again, it's being able to dynamically say, what do we need from this EV in this place, in this situation? And that's where I hope we get to pretty quickly. But we're definitely on the road there.
So Bill Carney has applied the equity lens to this and has asked, what are ways to meet Justice 40 requirements with vehicle to grid applications?
I think actually, so communities are designated as disadvantaged communities, environmental justice communities. There are different zones that are designated as communities that will actually qualify for the funds, qualify as a Justice 40 community. Pretty sure how that's going to work. So essentially, it's more about who is applying for it. They're sort of reserving and essentially saying these have to go to communities like that.
And Bill, did you have a follow-up to that?
Just the broad overall question of when do we get to plug in?
when do you get to plug in your EV or?
Well, this whole system, I mean, we've been promised this, it was a couple of months away for several years now. So, when does this actually hit the road here?
Actually, it kind of depends, if we're talking about like federal funding, for example, the different departments that are running it are pushing out the funding as fast as they can. So like the EPA school bus program, they're opening their application window for schools across the country in April. It'll be a 3-month application, and then they'll do a lottery essentially to try and make it fair. And hopefully a couple months after that, we'll actually have funding going out. There are, the big alternative fuel corridors. It takes more planning state level, as I mentioned. And so even though, the states they have to have their applications in by August. California will probably be earlier than that. But I don't know how much back and forth there is before that funding actually gets released. What I do know is that federal funding, just like state funding, is a lump sum, but it's spread over a certain amount of years. So like if you've got 200 million to spend this year, it has to go out this year. So it actually, there is a timer set on this. That's about all I can say about how the federal funding is working. Depends on the agency.
Thanks.
So the next 2 questions really have to do with what capabilities vehicles already have or will have. David Mahler asks, if the EV has its own inverter, are there compatibility issues with having an external bidirectional charger and vehicle to grid integration?
Really, it's definitely, I wish I had a whiteboard, but if the inverter is in the charger, it's because the EV is like a Nissan Leaf, for example, is charging on DC power. It's charging on direct current and then actually flowing that current to battery in the car. So that means that the inverter has to be in the charging station to change the alternating current that's coming through your house to something the car can use. If the car is charging on regular alternating current, just like what is flowing to your computer, then the car is going to need to convert it to direct current that the motor can use in the car. And therefore, it would have the inverter in the car. And so you wouldn't have an EV with the inverter in the car that's doing that conversion, plugging into an EVSE that would also do that conversion. Essentially, it's just not usually the kind of station you'd have. I think that Ford and Sunrun are looking at some kind of a mixed thing where the EV would like charge in alternating current and discharge in direct current. But in general, you wouldn't usually run into that mix of devices, is what I'm saying. It's just sort of the way that you would get sold your EVSE in your car. You wouldn't run into that.
And then a related question is, I think I know the answer to this, will all 2022 or 2023 EV car models be equipped with bidirectional capabilities? And what I would add, and if not, how prevalent is it, or will it be?
No, call your congressman. I think we're seeing more and more automotive manufacturers starting to introduce models or schedule models that are going to be bidirectional. You've got it from, I'm seeing Kia, Hyundai, but also Volkswagen, Volvo, Honda. They're all coming out with models, or they have models that are actually operating in other countries that haven't been introduced here. So I think there will be a lot more that come out fairly quickly. I think that I think that Lucid and Rivian were actually also working with it. But that's something that needs to be checked on. Don't go to them and say Jackie Pirro said, but I think they are. But so I think it's something that you'll just see more and more models that are available, but it's not going to be appropriate for every model. And they're not going to want to do it for every model. So
I want to interject a question of my own. Jackie, earlier you said that there was a stream of money that was coming into the state, and that a local advocacy group would do well to be monitoring what's happening there. What's the best entry point for understanding what's under consideration before it becomes a public announcement?
I know that, so you can start out first. The federal government actually put out some pretty good guidance documents, and they're not the 5,000 page, tax code guidance documents. They actually, if you look up just NEVI, federal, they are trying to make it very clear what this funding is meant to go to, how it's meant to work. And they did it fairly specifically for states to actually, a fairly specific structure within the states would work. So you'll have a general idea already. And I mean, I think it's like a bullet pointed document. But then, and I haven't jumped into these groups, but I would contact the Department of Transportation and just ask them, as I said, they had stakeholder committees, advisory committees that they're actually working with. So I don't think that these things are meant to be very private. It's just very esoteric. So I think just getting in touch with the Department of Transportation in California would be a place to start. Yes.
Okay. And then Annika, I think made a comment that that you covered. You mentioned the Kia EV6 and Hyundai Ioniq 5 have is it bidirectional charging? Is that what you're saying, Annika? I'm not quite clear.
They're saying those can go to like a critical load panel, or that you can actually, some EVs, just like an existing pickup truck, may actually have like an outlet in the back of the EV that you can literally run an extension cord to it. That's one of the things that the F-150 also does, but they have welder's plug, or talking, like 240 power that can come out of these things. That's one way to do it. A second way is if you have an already installed critical load panel at your house that says, if there's a power outage, I'm going to power my refrigerator, my CPAP, and maybe one lights in one room. The last thing is this idea that Decibel is looking at, and that the F-150 is looking at, that you could have a much more robust, to use those words, home energy management system where you could power your entire house for some period of time.
Okay.
Yeah, really.
Ken?
If I can chime in for a minute, this is John from Decibel again. In relation to that, instead of a backed up loads panel, there are some new electrical panels coming out with smart breakers, where you might, like if you're going to do an electrification upgrade anyway, and you're going to upgrade your panel to 200 amps, there's some really great offerings coming out that have built-in backed up load breakers, can avoid that whole sub panel situation potentially, and have whole house backup.
Yep, agreed. What he said.
Ken?
Yeah, Jackie, Marin County is going to come out with an EV readiness plan in the next couple of months. We don't have a lot of visibility into it, but I know it's certainly going to have something to do with where we need to have charging infrastructure and the like. Are there any particular things that you'd like to see included in that kind of a plan that would future-proof it at this point?
I am definitely, Marine Clean Energy again has done some really cool work with load management, with automated load management of EVSEs, which really assesses, do you need a big grid upgrade for these new installations that you're putting in? Or can you actually, if you charge these EVs in the right way, understanding the EVs that you have, can you charge these in a way that will use the existing infrastructure more efficiently, better, and cram more actual energy running through them? That kind of thing, I think, should be a priority across the country, because otherwise we could quadruple the capacity of the grid trying to install enough EVSEs to actually make this a workable solution. And so starting now and individually assessing the use cases at each site, I think, is the most important thing for me.
So Kurt Johnson says the Climate Center would like to collaborate with others to write a vehicle to grid opportunity overlay based on whatever data Transportation Authority of Marin comes out with regarding the current and expected future EV fleet in Marin. So that's a statement by Kurt.
Sounds good.
And then Annika Osborne from Ride and Drive Clean Bay Area. Do I have that right, Annika? Just makes a comment that the Rivian truck can power up appliances and electric tools as well. No need for a gas generator. I know, Jackie, in the presentation that you gave the Vehicle to Grid Integration Council, the person from Ford was really pushing that ability to plug in your power tools.
Yeah.
So I guess Rivian is doing the same thing. Leslie Alden asked Ken, can you be more specific and define Marin? Is that Marin County Transportation Authority of Marin?
All I know is all we know, and maybe somebody's got better insight on this. Christina O'Rourke is working on it. And in fact, she was originally going to be speaking this month to us if the plan was out. It's not quite out yet. So she'll be speaking to COG in the next month or two after the plan comes out. So I think this is, this is some sort of a Marin County plan. But beyond that, I can't tell you. Somebody else may have more insight than I do.
Well, I know that all of the city planners that are part of MCEP were asked to put together, they were surveyed, asked to put together not only where they are right now with their EV fleet planning, but where they plan to be, not just pie in the sky, but where they're really planning to be. So I think this report will be kind of a cumulation of all of those plans. I know that MCE, we're working on a vehicle fleet pilot, and we're also doing some additional surveying of our customers. That's going to go obviously beyond Marin County. So we're going to be collecting quite a bit of information. We're looking forward to seeing this MCEP report as well, but I know that all the cities within the county have been part of putting information together.
And
Carly?
Senator Fell, I know, is tagging along on that as well. And I think most other jurisdictions. So it's a really important step. And we need to make sure it's as strong as possible. Whatever EV plan they come up with is as strong as possible.
Carlene? You're
muted.
There you go. We still can't hear you. Okay, another time. I think we're coming to the end of the questions. Question, or at least a comment that I have, Jackie, is that in that March 17th webinar, you sounded pretty impatient with the lack of future proofing that was going on, because you make a commitment now, it's a capital expense, you're locked in. Do you want to expand on that and have any thoughts about what we can do to help that future proofing?
There's actually a bill that I just found out about in California. It's AB 2700, I think. And I think it's meant to actually address this a bit. And it's really with this, the way that utilities work is that they essentially wait until you need an upgrade and then they do the upgrade. And this bill is looking to, I think, build on the CEC's infrastructure needs assessment, increase communication and data sharing between CARB and CEC and CPUC and any other relevant agencies, and try to actually push for future-proofing streamlined utility processes to actually connect EVs and look a little further into the future. I am impatient, but I understand why the utilities work that they do, because there's a balancing side that says we don't want the grid to be overbuilt or gold-plated, as they say, over-invested in. And so figuring out how to actually make room so that, like, for example, a school that is electrifying their school bus fleet as they're able to obtain funding and no faster. How does a school tell the utility how many EVs they're going to be able to actually hook up over the next 5 years or 10 years? Right now they can't. And so it actually has a chilling effect on the ability of schools to work effectively with utilities. It's possible that all this funding for any number of stakeholders is actually going to make that a little bit less of a problem. There will be more certainty or more hope anyway from these various stakeholders that they'll be able to electrify at a consistent rate and be able to work more with utilities and more of a partnership. That's my hope.
Sorry. So Carlene, you were not on mute. I unmuted you and then been going back and forth to try to enable you to speak. Can you speak? No, we're going to have to read your lips.
You might log on and off.
I did want to address, actually, someone brought up EV battery warranties, and I'm really glad that you asked the question. It's something that should always be discussed because everyone has that question, and so we should always talk about it. What we've seen so far is that companies, as automakers, actually put this capability in their EVs. They then need to think and project how that EV will be used, because they're also dealing with car battery durability regulations. And so they need to think through, what are we going to authorize as an acceptable use of this capability that will still enable us 10 or 15 years and 150,000 miles down the road to, not have any kind of an aggregate effect from the extra usage. What we've done is actually take charge and discharge patterns. So when we wanted to participate in a market in Denmark, we went to the auto manufacturer with 2 months worth of data and said, this is what we would be doing with your car. Please run it through your accelerated degradation models that you use to see how your battery is going to react, and tell us if you think that this is a good idea or not. And I think that's the kind of work that the automakers are going to need to do to ensure that their cars do serve the original purpose while also being a resource of a different type.
So I think we're pretty much towards the end. Carlene, you're still not able to speak. And I think Ken's idea is logging out and logging back in would be a good one. So why don't we wrap this up then? And I want to thank you for a wonderfully content-rich presentation, and your answers in the discussion is just terrific, and will help us in figuring out how we can be most effective in our advocacy work. Yeah, it's really, really terrific that you made the time to be here. Do you have any last comments?
I think first I would respond to David Haskell about discharge rates as being the
Okay.
key to warranties, saying right now rates are modest. And if you're discharging at low rates, then that may preserve the battery durability. I think these things need to be contextualized in the larger usage of the car too. How many 350 kilowatt charges are actually going to balance out the discharges you might do in emergencies in the summer? There are a lot of very brutal things that these batteries are being put through and will be put through as we use cars in different ways. And so figuring out how discharging fits in with those other things the battery is going through is going to be very important. My closing statement is thank you so much for inviting me. It's really inspiring when you're sitting in windowless beige rooms in the CPUC to know that there are actually groups out there that are taking their extra time to push for these things too. Groups like this are the wind at my back when I'm actually trying to figure out how to fit my technology into structures where it may not fully fit. And also I'd say that you're at least as important as the government agencies when a unified voice like yours comes. It can make a real difference. So thank you so much for listening. And if there's anything that I can do to give you more information and facilitate your efforts, please get back in touch.
Yeah, well, we're a big believer in that no good deed go unpunished, so we'll take you up on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bob, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
Carlene.
We're on.
I needed to log back in. I don't know why.
Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, I just
you-
want to make a comment about the TAM EV readiness plan. TAM currently has an interpretation of the Measure B funds that charging stations can only be placed on public land, whereas many other agencies and the new US DOT funding that's coming from the federal government is public land as well as publicly accessible stations. So I think that it would probably be a good idea for maybe this group to think about the TAM board and whether they might take a look at it. I know Diane Steinhauser, when she was executive director, was thinking about this. It never actually came to a board level, but it seems that especially with federal funds to administer these, we don't want to just limit them to public lands, is my opinion.
Okay. With that addendum, thank you, Jackie.
Thank you.
So we're going to move then quickly to a brief segment on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6 assessment. It's a long report. It's multidimensional. An 8 or 10 minute presentation can't do it nearly enough justice, but it's crucial. So Belle and Bill Carney are going to talk about it. We'll have a brief discussion, and then we'll want to address this at a later date. So Belle?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I just wanted to start out by saying that the IPCC finalized the third part of the 6th assessment report, Climate Change 2022, Mitigation of Climate Change, the working group. It was finalized on the 4th of April, so it's new. We wanted to alert you to the findings, both the dire predictions and the hopeful solutions. Basically, we're out of time. At a later date, we will tie this to Marin and to national energy and climate policy, to the war in Ukraine, to what's going on with the EU and the bans on coal, possibly, and the ban on oil and gas.
Good.
We'll do that later. But now what we'd like to do is show you some of the highlights of this report. It's a long set of slides, but we've selected a few. And there's a lot of information and you just have to read. Just say a few words. So thank you. So here's the first one. By the way, this presentation is based on what IPCC itself produced. This is their slideshow, and we're very fortunate to be able to log into it. So it's about, the first thing we just want to say about this is that mitigation is the subject of this report. Next slide. Okay. And that nations are not doing enough to prevent global warming from increasing to dangerous levels. What they're saying, acting to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emission now before it's too late. Next slide. Okay. Acting now makes a huge difference in the livability of the planet. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade and limiting warming to 2.0 centigrade. You can see what the differences are and what it can take to achieve this. Next slide. And there are options available now in every sector that it can at least have emissions by 2030. And these are solutions to dramatically reduce emissions of all sectors, not just energy, but all sectors. Next slide. With respect to energy, energy is fundamental. We have shown how in Marin with MCE, we can achieve some of these results. Next slide. Transportation. Ramping up EV adoption is key. California can show how. This is a very important summary slide. Thank you. Next slide. Buildings. Building electrification is within the power of local government if we can spur the political will of local office holders and candidates. Next slide. Industry. There's not much industry in Marin, but our product choices and state policy can make a difference. Next slide. Carbon dioxide removal. Sequestration is essential to close emission gaps. Again, Marin is leading with carbon farming initiatives. Next slide. Land use. And with protecting and caring for natural and agricultural lands, open space, MMWD, MALT, MWPA, we're moving in this direction. We have a lot going on here. Thank you. Next slide. Cities and urban areas. There are options for existing rapidly growing and new cities. Local action in cities can span all sectors to drive both emissions reductions and sequestration. Next slide. Demand and services. Individual choices need systemic support and equitable results. Next slide. Policies, regulatory and economic instruments. Systemic action by government and economics can get the job done if we act now at all levels. Next slide. The evidence is clear. The time for action is now. Again, the IPCC's basic conclusion is that we need to act now. And so that's the end of the slideshow for all of you. And if we can make it available to those of you who were able to read that fast. And we will have a follow-up to this with the new developments. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Bill, do you want to comment?
Me?
Just, I think if we could make this available, perhaps on the MCL website, that would give people a chance to absorb it a bit more and get ready for when we come back in a couple of months to delve into it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we definitely will do that. And what I neglected to say earlier is that we'll have an edited version of the previous session, which Jackie Bureau also made available on the website, hopefully sometime soon. What I would like to do is to alert you to a couple of resources that are out there on this. Carbon Briefs tends to have good reports, thoughtful and well-researched reports on issues. And they have a pretty in-depth look at the report, something which is more accessible. It's a podcast that I listened to it's a David Roberts podcast, Volt, which is generally very good. Paulina Jaramillo, who was the coordinating author for the last of the 6 assessment reports, talked about it, and it's a terrific oral summary of what's in the most recently released report. And so that's one place to go, and I'm sure other people have other sources that could summarize what is a pretty big document. And if you want to put them in chat, that will work out really well. So is there further discussion about this? We'll deal with this at a later date. Seeing none, let's move on to Carlene, who can present on some very recent research that she's conducted with UC Berkeley faculty member and others. Carlene?
Okay, hopefully you can hear me. For those of you that don't know or you don't know me, I'm Carlene Cullen. I'm the founder and executive director of Cool the Earth and Ride and Drive Clean. Cool the Earth, I started in 15 years ago in 2006 to educate people about climate change and inspire them to take personal action. And then about 3 years ago, we started this collaboration that keeps expanding and changing its name because the expansion is now Ride and Drive Clean. It's a national program to educate people about driving electric. So since we started this, we have about 10,000 people who signed up with us to help get them switched from a gas car to an electric car. So that's really exciting. And it's a big collaboration. Many of your organizations that are here are part of helping us in this outreach. So just in this work, in working with EV drivers, and also when I was Newsom's policy advisor for how we electrify transportation in California in 2017 and 2018, things look very bright about the EV future, but we kept coming upon personally, as well as through lots of drivers we were helping convert to EV, issues with the open system, non-Tesla charging systems. And there was sufficient widespread anecdotal information that we ended up going to, Sue Saunders was a key part of this, through Mike McGuire and also through CARB and with the EV squad that David and Robin Mueller runs. It's a whole bunch of people that are a part of this. I get to report on this. So we had a meeting with the California Energy Commission and California Resources Board, and the staff had no idea that there were any problems at all. And when we brought to them the issue of all these reports about the problems, they basically said, well, that's just anecdotal information, that's a consumer issue, and basically tried to blow us off. We got the governor involved, or it's the governor, he got involved. Jared Huffman's been very involved. A direct report to Pete Buttigieg in Office of Transportation. We had direct meetings with them as well. And so one of the outcomes of this is that CARB performed an informal survey of several thousand EV drivers that was pushed out through a lot of nonprofits. And 70% of the respondents said that they had problems with charging inoperable stations for a number of reasons. At the same time, so 40% of them reported they had to call the EVSP, the EV service provider, the manufacturer, to get a charge to initiate. And at the same time, CARB interviewed the EVSPs, and they said they had a 97 to 98% uptime. So somebody's not actually counting the data in the same way. And so we kept hearing over and over again that there was only anecdotal information. We partnered with Professor Emeritus David Rempel from UC Berkeley, and through a large volunteer force, we tested every single DC fast charge plug, non-Tesla, in the Bay Area. There were 657 plugs at 181 stations. This is, through the entire Bay Area. We basically tested, we told the testers that they could use 2 credit cards, try both of them twice, a chip, a swipe. So those are 4 methods to try to pay. They could use a membership card, or they could use the app. So those are all different ways. And obviously consumers don't want to go through all that, but those were the mechanisms. And the station needed to be able to maintain a charge for just 2 minutes. Out of those, 72.5% failed even that basic test. So it's a huge concern. We had about 4.5% of those couldn't actually even reach a popular car like the Bolt or the Mustang. I'll say I know at least 3 of those DC fast charging stations in Marin, and we don't have that many, fall into that category. 2 are in Mill Valley and 1's in Novato. They can't reach even the most popular cars. We went back about 8 days later and did about a 10% reevaluation of the plug, so about another 70 plugs, and found that basically there was no change. Some of the stations were working again, some of the other ones failed, and basically net, there was no change in uptime performance. So these were obviously very concerning. We brought this to the attention again of the Energy Commission, CARB, the DOT. California Energy Commission hosted a reliability workshop and invited me to be a presenter along with Tesla, Ford, ChargePoint, and Flow. And basically I was the consumer advocate, reporting out. The study wasn't published yet. I can drop a link, or maybe Monica or someone who works in this could drop a link into the chat with the study. Basically I was saying consumers won't tolerate this. This whole market's going to stall or fail. I know there's so much excitement. We're also excited about this, but if we can't charge, and it's a major equity issue for people in our low income communities, and anybody who rents will be relying heavily on this charging infrastructure. And, a 27% failure rate is obviously not going to cut it. After that presentation, the Energy Commission, I'm very good friends with a lot of people now at the Energy Commission and CARB and DOT working through all this, because ultimately they've been doling out contracts with absolutely no uptime requirement, no performance requirements at all. CARB, when they settled the VW Dieselgate with the Department of Justice, with EPA, et cetera, in California, VW negotiated no uptime. CARB said they tried to get an uptime in that settlement of $2 billion. So VW knew what they were doing and saying no uptimes, and their stations are failing. So they are in a heavy lobbying mode right now. These companies, many of them are public. VW, Electrify America is public under VW. Just the public stations, not in VW, have valuations of over $10 billion combined. So they are tossing all their lobbying efforts, trying to get the Energy Commission, CARB, US DOT, DOE with this new funding from Biden to have either no uptime performance at all.
Design.
Sorry? Either no uptime performance at all, or to have these standards in that are so lax. Like for instance, one of the EVSPs, they're not on this call, Electrify America, they are counting when a session fails within the first 2 or 3 minutes, they're not reporting that to CARB as a failure. They're reporting that under a category called short sessions. So these are not honest brokers in this. The only EVSP that has been pushing for reliability and strict standards is a company called Flow. Most of their stations, they have an extensive DC fast charging network in Canada. They have some now in the US. Their performance, and you go on to PlugShare, they get perfect scores. They have invested since the beginning in these stations. They manufactured everything on their own. All the other vendors are basically getting off-the-shelf components and kludging them together. And you can see this. It's kind of I hate to say it to be so crass now, but I'm pretty unhappy about this, is, that it's kind of take the money and run, and the government didn't have any sort of restrictions in place about this. So Commissioner Monahan, the CEC commissioner, just yesterday, there was a major reliability workshop again with a lot of the EVSPs, and she was the keynote speaker. She, in the first 2 minutes of her presentation, cited the study from Cool the Earth and UC Berkeley, cited some of our numbers, and said government needs to take action. And so we are really happy about that. She also noted that what California is doing, she is very engaged with the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, which is the DOT and DOE, to roll out this Biden funding. Yeah, so there's a lot happening. It's a total David and Goliath story, because there's just kind of a group of us, a core group of us working on this, and then the folks at the EV Squad supporting this and engaging. And so what's next is we are now trying to lobby our position with UC Berkeley and other experts about what reliability and uptime means. What is actually defined as uptime? Who calculates that? Who reports to it? Reports the data? Is it going to NREL in a database? What's downtime? What's excluded time? So, I can tell you a lot of these companies, as soon as a station is noted as down or not functioning, they just currently put that in excluded time. So no wonder their rates look like 97%, because there's failures and they just put in excluded time. There's a major equity issue that they want to have any vandalism or theft, and there seems to be an increasing amount of theft because of the copper in the cables, that they want that into excluded time. But effectively that means, especially in our lower income communities where there may be more theft and vandalism, if that's an excluded time, the EVSP has no obligation to fix those stations at any time. So it's a big issue. It's a design issue. There's no surveillance. So, we feel also that if a customer makes a call to the EVSP and that's what's needed to actually get the station to be operable, that's a failure. Customers can't be expected to call and hang on the line while the EVSP reboots the machine or the customer does something different. Monday, we have a meeting with Governor Newsom's head of external affairs, as well as his chief advisor for climate change. The next 2 weeks, we have meetings with the PUC, CEC, and CARB jointly, maybe Caltrans as well, and also with that joint office of the DOT and the DOE. So I will tell you, Congressman Huffman has been a huge advocate of this. Back in the fall, when the infrastructure bill was getting written, he reached out to Nancy Pelosi. She's aware of the issue. Buttigieg is aware of the issue. It's a massive issue from a transition to EVs, as well as a democratic issue, because the governor and Biden, they're putting billions and billions of dollars into this, and it's a very significant issue. So that's my summary. Bob, you're on mute.
Thanks, Carlene. Is there a discussion?
Yeah, I have a question. Carlene, is this nationwide, this problem, or is it more concentrated in California? Can it be seen as something that affects all regions of the country?
Yeah. So, there has been only really anecdotal information. Plug-in Americas did a study of over 5,000 drivers across the US, and 53% of them reported they had stations that failed and they needed to call the station vendor to be able to get the station to operate. So there's widespread anecdotal information kind of under the major press radar, which is where we want to keep this. And then we did the first study ever in the Bay Area of all the plugs. You would imagine that the Bay Area would have the best, kind of to be the shining star for all of this.
Yeah.
So yes, it's a national issue.
And what about international? I mean, is there anybody doing it right?
Okay, international, great question. Except for Tesla, massive problems. The CEO of VW, they own one of the charging networks there as well. And he took a trip in his ID3 from one country in Europe to another, and it was in the press. He said, "This is abysmal. This cannot work." And this is one of the companies that they are part owner of. So, and I know people in Europe used to work for me and they said, yeah, only Tesla's reliable.
Uh-huh.
So
Okay,
in China, they have a different system. So that's working better.
so we're running out of time. So let's have the additional questions or comments be brief. Wow, that's very brief. Both hands went down instantly. Thank you. David?
Well, just a quick one, Carlene, and thank you. It's my experience too. Does this mean that perhaps the EV charging stations are going to have to be much more controlled rather than be more out there in the public? Is
Well,
is that at the end? Is that the result of this kind of research?
do you mean controlled by government contracts, or do you mean about like where they're physically located?
Physically located.
Yeah. Well, I brought that up at the CEC meeting and got a lot of pushback from the EVSPs. Ultimately, it's, I'm not government though. They say government shouldn't tell us what to do. And it's, well, I'm not government. So, I can advocate for whatever I want. It's very complicated about where these stations are going to go. We are advocating that they have to be resilient. So if there's a lot of theft, failure, vandalism, if they're not safe, like in the back of a parking lot, all these sorts of things, however those issues have to be resolved, they have to be resolved. So the EVSPs have to figure that out. We have some certain beliefs about how that's going to work, and the DO, and we now through all this have access to all the top players and all the staff, and so we're definitely now in the fight about how this should be rolled out, what should happen, and all these definitions. Our main focus right now is getting into every single contract. There has to be an uptime, and let's define what that exactly means. And downtime at the existing stations need to be brought into conformance before these companies get, another $1 billion of putting in systems that, work 75% of the time. It's very concerning.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's, thank you so much, Carlene.
You're welcome.
And for your work. Let's move on then to organization reports. No, I guess we have a couple of minutes. Ken, do you want to give a 3-minute update on CPUC proceedings?
Sure. One CPUC and one legislative thing. So good news out of the CPUC for a change. They ended up allocating $40 million in cap and trade funds for subsidies for heat pump water heaters statewide. So they're rolling out a significant program. It would involve subsidies for residential hot water heaters. Effectively, what they're trying to do is take all the additional costs of converting to an electric heat pump water heater, as opposed to just replacing your gas water heater. They're trying to cover all those costs. So you can get subsidies of up to $3,100 for the water heater in a residence. If you're low income, you can get up to $4,100. They're also going to pay for up to 50% of the cost of an electric panel upgrade. So again, either $2,000 or $4,000 if you're low income. So these are significant monies coming forward. And it's going to be administered statewide by a program administrator. It's probably going to be about 6 months before the money actually starts becoming available on this. These are subsidies for the consumers, but you can't get your subsidy till you've gotten your permit cleared. So they want to make sure people, go through the permit process to get these done right. But anyway, that's a good program, it seems to me, and it's rare to have good news out of the CPC, but I kind of like that one. Also on the building electrification front, I just wanted people to at least be alert to SB 1393, which is a bill in the legislature which would require any local or a municipality that was trying to pass any kind of a building electrification ordinance on existing buildings to get CEC approval to do so. And the CEC would not be allowed to approve an application If the commission determines that the requirement or any portion of the requirement is not technically feasible, is not cost effective, disproportionately impacts low and medium income consumers, adversely impacts a skilled and trained workforce, which to me could be the pipe fitters, the gas installers, or increases costs for ratepayers. So this is a bill that it's not quite a ban on local all electric ordinances, but it could effectively work that way for any relating to existing buildings. So we'll be keeping our eye on that one and maybe talking to our legislators about it.
Is there discussion? Thank you, Ken. David,
You're muted.
you're on mute.
You couldn't read my lips, eh? Sorry. Ken, just on that last one, SB 1393.
Yeah.
Who's sponsoring that in terms of who among the legislators is?
It was introduced by Senator Archuleta, and a principal co-author is Assembly Member Rodriguez. I don't know either of those two legislators.
And do you have any specific recommendation on right now where comments in opposition to that would get the most traction?
No, I think that you would start with your state senator, would be sending a comment to Mike McGuire, stating that you oppose the bill. In concept, there ought to be some, you can understand what they're trying to do. They're trying, at least theoretically, this is trying to make sure that these ordinances don't disproportionately impact low-income residents. But it seems to me the way they're setting it up, it might be very hard to get an ordinance through that would meet all these criteria.
Okay, so let's move on to the last set of items on our agenda, which is the organization reports. David, since you just spoke, why not continue but talk about the Sonoma, Marin Sonoma EBE squad?
Yeah, since my mic's already on, right? So I'll start just off that item we just talked about, our Marin Sonoma Building Electrification Squad, which is literally working on helping get all of the Marin jurisdictions lined up to adopt a REACH code to require that new buildings be all electric. And I think most of you heard the presentation in February where we had a panel of speakers who talked about that ongoing effort. So my update on that is the county is moving ahead. They've assembled two teams, a steering committee and a technical working group trying to represent all the jurisdictions, and most jurisdictions are participating in those. So they're moving ahead with starting the early phases of actually crafting a model ordinance on that. And you'll recall that in my presentation in February, I talked about how one of the things that the Building Electrification Squad was working on, just starting then, was to form jurisdictional teams to basically go to the electeds at each jurisdiction and advocate to inform those electeds of this county effort on the update of the Green Building Code, and to urge that the electeds direct their staff to participate, and when a model ordinance comes out to adopt that. So we're fairly far along in forming those teams. We have talking points. The county has prepared some FAQs to support the effort that we're making available. So all that is just about ready to launch. So you'll start seeing some of that. The other thing on the Building Electrification Squad that I want to report on is you're all aware of the regional housing needs allocation, and most jurisdictions in Marin are presently updating their housing elements in that context. And the fact is there is a lot of new residential development being proposed right now, thousands of units right here in Marin. This is not just between now and 2030. These are actual development projects that are in various phases of planning and so on. And the importance of this is right now, none of these would be subject to all electric requirements. So they would all be built with dual fuel infrastructure. And so the other thing the BE squad is doing is identifying those pending projects, reaching out directly to the developers and also to the jurisdictions of approval to urge that they be all electric. So, and we're having some good success there. On the EV squad front, we're, as Carlene's already noted, we're heavily supporting Ride and Drive Clean and Cool the Earth on the charger reliability study, working with them on advocacy events. And then this issue that I just talked about with the new development, same thing when we're reaching out to these development projects for encouraging them to be all electric. We're also encouraging them to be EV ready, because right now the requirements are pretty soft on that. So at the very least, to install conduit to make it easy to ultimately electrify every parking space, or have every parking space be charger. It's a lot cheaper to do it on the original construction than to retrofit later. So that's about my report. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Hey, this is John Sarter again. I developed a document while I was at the Clean Coalition along with Greg Thompson, called the Electrification and Community Microgrid Ready document. I'm going to update that to include V2H architecture, and I'll share it with you, David, and everybody, if you'd like.
Great, thank you.
Great. Okay, so Bill, Sustainable Santa Fe. Bill, I think Bill
Hi.
just.
Yeah, a couple of quick things. Would urge everybody to come out to a candidates forum specifically geared on climate and environmental issues with the 4 candidates for our state assembly. That's coming up on next Thursday, April 21st, 7 o'clock. It is being put on by the League of Women Voters with 3 of the organizations here hosting it, MCL, OFA, and Sustainable San Rafael. So it's a really great opportunity to hear these 4 really good candidates for a very important position, talking specifically on the issues of concern to this group. And then the second thing I wanted to mention coming up, and by the way, that's Earth Day Eve. The official Earth Day is the 22nd, so it's appropriately timed as well. And then the following Sunday, the 24th, I think most of you probably know that Green Change is putting on what we're taking to be an Earth Day celebration event, or I think it's called Earth 2050. And that's at the Mill Valley Community Center, 1 to 5. And many of our groups will also be tabling there, as well as there's a concurrent associated EV event at that time. So, and that place. So anyway, encourage your attendance at both those events. Thanks.
Thanks, Bill. Bill, you have an ESP announcement?
Yes, I do. There's a, and some of you may not know, ESP, Ecologically Sound Practices Partnership, which advises the MWPA, and we're having our monthly meeting, which is April 19th, which is Tuesday. And I put into the chat how to join the meeting, and it's going to be about monitoring and monitoring the activities of MWPA in fire prevention, and it looks pretty interesting. So if you want to join us, just either let me know or look at the chat and see the way to join. Thank you.
Okay, great. Ride and Drive Clean.
Hi, thanks, Bob. So yeah, we're in the midst of our Ride and Drive Clean Marin campaign. We've completed 3 webinars, and we had one very successful EV and e-bike show in San Rafael in collaboration with the Rotary program last weekend. We had over 200 attendees. It was really great. We still have some really exciting programming ahead. Next week, we have a bilingual webinar, how to save money with an EV. And then we have 2 EV and e-bike shows, one in Novato on Tuesday and another in Mill Valley with the Earth 2050 that Bill was just mentioning program. That's coming up on Sunday. Along with a dozen different EV models and e-bikes, we're excited to be showcasing some of those EVs that I mentioned in my chat a little bit earlier. The Kia EV6 will be there. We'll be demoing that bi-directional capability. And we'll have a Rivian truck at each of these events. So we're super excited to see all of these great cutting edge EVs at our events. I'll drop some information in the chat so you can join us for an event either as a volunteer with your EV or e-bike, or you can come check out these super cool EVs and e-bikes. I'll also throw my contact information in there. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Are there any other announcements? Okay, so we'll see you folks next month. Know that there are discussions about continuing some presentations and discussions on electric vehicles. We've mentioned in the past, we will have Christina O'Rourke presenting the Marin EV readiness plan when that's ready. And we're also contemplating having a speaker talk about solar and especially EV and mobility solutions for lower income communities. Again, applying that equity lens. So some interesting sessions to come. So with that, I think what we'll do is just draw it to a close.
Bob,
Thank
can
you,
I say
folks.
something for that equity, EV equity? We've been doing a lot of work in that area also with the Canal Alliance and others. So when you're formulating that, I'd love to be able to share some information.
Terrific. Good.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank
Good
you,
to see
folks.
everyone.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.